This is how pawns affect your bishops. Now, a pawn is an incredible piece to ensure that you have control of certain areas of the board. Bishops, of course, they're really great at cutting through areas. They're often not used for control as much as attacking, and maybe making sure an enemy piece or two doesn't land on one of their squares. But pawns are known for control, bishops more for the attack. And pawns and bishops, because they don't have the same, attacking style, bishops and pawns can kind of be rather impetuous upon themselves. Is that the word? Does anybody know? Is impetuous the word? Like they impede on each other. There's constantly a battle between whether your bishops are well placed because of the pawn structure or poorly placed. But with that being said, if you know how to use your pawn structure really well, your bishops can actually be complementary. All right, so you've got to make sure your pawns and your bishops are working together. You're on the same team. Bishop and pawns meet. Hello. I'm a bishop. I'm a pawn. I love you. That's okay. All right. You got to be good with each other. Right. This is okay. This is not okay. Because the bishop runs into the pawn. You know what I'm saying? You feel me? So you got to just learn how the pawns and bishops work. So let's talk about that. So how would you assess this position if you were either side? Well, we're looking at it from White's perspective. So how would you assess this from White's perspective? His bishop that I've highlighted here on C1, it's not developed, but it's clearly very active. It can get active very quickly. It can go to this long diagonal. Namely, it could go to a square like G5, where it can target this knight on F6, maybe take it out of the game because the knight's good at central control. Maybe this pawn is important to defend, so you can try to go bishop E3 to help control D4. This bishop has a lot of potential in this exact position. The bishop here on C4 is a very actively well-placed piece based on White's pawn structure. You'll notice this bishop is targeting F7, and who sees that lollipop on the end of the stick? That's the king right there, and I'd love to get my hands on that king, the bishop says. Of course, the bishop doesn't have any hands because it's just a hat. But regardless, it would like to attack the king. So it's kind of got this jewel on the end of the line. Of course, it's also aiming this way. It can retreat if it's attacked and can do whatever it needs. It can defend the center. The bishop is really an active piece. So based on the pawn structure, and by the way, that's how you always evaluate bishops. You evaluate bishops based on the pawn structure. The bishops and the pawns are very complementary for the white pieces. For black, though, it's a little bit different. It's not quite perfect. For black, his light square bishop here on C8 is much more of he's more of a spectator. Let's just call it that. I mean, he's not doing anything. He's not a warrior. He's not out there fighting. He's defending the B7 pawn. He's praying for him, but that B7 pawn doesn't need to be defended. The bishop's not doing very much at all. So you can see how the bishop and pawn's not being very complementary here. There's also the fact that this knight is kind of blocking the bishop, but we don't really have a problem as much with knights and other pieces blocking the bishops because guess what? Knights move. Knights are, they're horses. Horses jump around, right? So they're gonna go. The knight's gonna go to B6, try to attack the bishop, or he's gonna hop around F6 at some point. Maybe if the other knight moves, he's pretty happy. So this bishop will eventually get out, and the pawn structure is not hampering it too badly. So for instance, the bishop might be able to hop out quickly to E6 to challenge the enemy bishop, which I was just saying was a very good bishop, or even pop all the way down to G4 because of the target on F3. It's not too hard for that bishop to get active. The bishop on E7, though, is the most interesting piece on the board. So this bishop is, of course, really bad right now. The bishop is blockading the pawn. Remember what I was saying? Love, hate, because, the bishops are diagonal pieces. You want the pawns beside the bishops. You don't want the bishops behind the pawns trying to attack diagonally. So this is the problem with this bishop. And you'll, of course, also notice the knight is blocking, the rook, the queen. This bishop, of course, can't move anywhere. You would say this is the most horrific piece you've ever seen in the history of the world. But bear with me here. I talked about this a little bit in my last Twitch stream. If you did not watch the last Twitch stream, what are you doing? Not watching every single one of my Twitch streams. Make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss a beat. Go back and watch those old videos on YouTube or on Twitch. Either one is fine. So these pieces, I told you, it's more about their potential. So like I said, that light square bishop can come out. The dark square bishop could also come out. But where would the bishop go out to, assuming this knight left? Well, if the bishop went out to h4, it'd be captured by our knight. If it goes out to g5, it would be captured by either our bishop or our knight. And if it went out to f6, it would be attacking this pawn. So you would say, wait a second, it doesn't have much potential at all. It looks actually like it's really horrible. Like it's horrible now, and then if it becomes less horrible later, it will still be horrible. Does that mean it's not horrible? It's just like a lesser degree horrible. You've got like level 10 black belt horrible, and then like level 9 black belt horrible. I don't know. Well, in this case, it's not actually so true. So if black knows what he's doing here, he might actually consider saying, hey, you know what? At some point, I know this knight's going to move. I'm great with that. So the knight's going to move. It's going to make way for the bishop. Maybe the knight will do a fancy maneuver over here to start attacking the queen side or something like that. And then this bishop will hop over to f6. So one would think maybe a good move would be to move the knight out of the way, or to take on d4 immediately, and then to bring the bishop out, because that would be just a grand move. But the king in the palace, who's chomping on his grapes or doing whatever, sitting in back, really doing nothing, doesn't seem to care about his peasants. Doesn't like his bishops for some reason. And he commands, I should say, the move which really hurts the bishop more than any other move on the board. He commanded the move pawn to c5. And this move, the bishop looked at. He understood something. He understood that that move was a bishop-killing move. Why is that the case? Well, let's think about it like this. It's white's turn now. White has to make a decision about this d4 pawn. What black was thinking was, let's just increase the pressure in the center. Let's crack it. Let's force him to move forward, or to take our c pawn, or to take our e pawn. And whichever one he takes, we're going to recapture with, I don't know, a knight or something. I don't know. Well, not a knight, because then the pawn would be... So we will recapture with the pawn at some point. We're going to be doing really good. But white here, in the actual game, plays another really horrible bishop's decision. You play the move pawn to d5. The bishop's now blocked by its own pawn. Now, maybe the bishop can find life somewhere else, but do you really think that for a little bit of space, killing your best bishop was worth it? The knight, of course, has a similar thought. Remember, we just talked about how knights want outposts in the center, and the knight here has this beautiful square on d5 that he can go to. He's got his binoculars. Ooh, d5, that's beautiful. I want to get over there someday. And then, of course, he sees the bishop and the pawn. Why are the bishop and the pawn talking over there? Oh, the pawn is... Wait, why is the pawn going to d5? It's because the king didn't really think about the health of his bishop or his knight. Played the move pawn to d5. Circle back around. Before we leave this example, let me remind you about this bishop now. Black accepted the consequences with this move. Remember, I told you that the knight wanted to move, and the bishop would come out to f6, and the bishop would go down this diagonal? Well, guess what? The pawn on e5 now, when the bishop comes to f6, he sits there and says, hey, mate! I guess he's got an Australian accent now. Why don't you move? Can't move anymore, can he? The pawn is blocked. White's pawn is blocking his bishop, and now we just have a bishop pity party. Which bishop is worse? I don't know. Both of these moves are bishop-killing moves. These are the moves you have to avoid. Now, hopefully with this crazy talk back and forth between the bishop and the pawn, maybe you understand something here that you didn't understand before. The pawns and the bishops need to be complementary with each other. You cannot put your pawns in front of your bishops. You can't destroy your own bishops. That's why in the opening, you play pawn to e4 or pawn to d4 as white. And that immediately opens up the bishop. Pawn to e4. That opens up the bishop to come out. Pawn to d4. That opens up this bishop to come out. When you do this, you're improving the fate of your bishops because you know that. You've watched the Queen's Gambit, so you know you got to play 1d4. Or you just like attacking, so you play 1e4. But you're not also realizing that those moves are actually really good for your bishops. And it's not okay later on to keep pushing these pawns or to put your bishops into positions where they're really blocked and they can't do anything. So that's what I want to leave you with here with this example. Going back, though, maybe a better move for white. We already talked about black should have probably captured on d4 before pushing pawn to c5. But white maybe should do the same. Maybe he should capture on e5. Now all of a sudden this queen is aiming at d6, so the pawn should recapture. And why is this so strong for white? First, this now opens up the d5 square for the knight, a beautiful hole. The bishop is still able to see that king, at least x-ray that king. The pawn on f7 is, of course, attacked. Then, furthermore, because d4 and e5 have already been kind of decided, the battle's been decided, and because the c5 pawn now still exists on c5, you'll notice that while we, with that decision, were able to keep the health of our bishops and knights in mind, now we realize that we're also keeping the enemy bishop dead based on black's original idea of pushing pawn to c5. Now these two pawns are permanently never moving in the history of this game. They're stuck. And that means this bishop is a really bad piece. Now when it goes to f6, it's biting on granite because that pawn is never going to move. If it goes to d6, I mean, maybe like it can do this, but that's so slow. And white's going to be building up an attack in the meantime, and there's just no way that that bishop is going to ever find life. Pawn structure makes the most important piece. Pawn structure is the most important piece, if you will. I mean, pawns are broken out into 8 individual units, but as a whole, they determine how good your pieces are. If your knights are good, then it's possibly because they have a great outpost, because the knight can go into a square, because it's defended by your pawns. If your bishops are good, it's often because your bishops are able to go from one side of the board to the other without being obstructed by their own pawns. So pawn structure is so critically important.